The dog started screaming into the storm before Jack Sutton even had his boots laced, not barking, screaming, that high, frantic sound a working dog makes when something is terribly wrong, and there is no time left to be polite about it. Jack came off the porch into a whiteout, 11 below zero with the snow coming sideways off the mountain, and he ran for the kennel with his coat half on and his heart already going hard. He had not even reached the gate when he saw her, a child. A little girl, no more than 8, on her hands and knees in the drifts against the kennel fence, so cold she had stopped shivering, which, Jack knew with a cold lurch of his own, is the worst sign of all, and pressed flat against the wire on the other side, his whole body laid the length of hers through the fence, was Jack's German shepherd, sharing the only warmth he had in the world. She had crawled there. God alone knew how far, across an Alaskan mountainside in the dark in a blizzard, to the first living thing she could find. And the dog had not barked at the stranger in the snow. The dog had lain down in the cold and tried to keep her alive until somebody came. The little girl lifted her head and looked up at Jack through frozen lashes, and she got 4 words out before her eyes rolled back. My daddy. The car. Before we go on, tell us where you're watching from in the comments below. If this story moves you, please subscribe and stay with it until the very end. We read every single one, and what that little girl had crawled away from, and the man who left her family to freeze, is something you will not soon forget. Jack Sutton was 45 years old and built like a man who had spent his life going into the places everyone else was trying to get out of. He stood 6'2", lean and weathered down to hard rope and bone, with iron gray hair cut short and a beard gone mostly white in forearms, scarred from rock and rope and worse. He moved without hurry, except when hurry was the only thing that mattered, and then he moved like a man the rest of the world had been built around. His hands were enormous and sure. He had a way of holding still and reading a situation in a single sweep that he had bought, over 20 years, at a price most people never had to pay. His eyes were a pale glacial blue that measured a place the instant he entered it, the footing, the wind, the distances, the time he had. Out of a habit, 2 decades of service had pressed into the deepest part of him. They were not cold eyes, whatever the strangers, who rarely visited, assumed. They were the eyes of a man who had pulled people out of the worst places on earth, and had not always been fast enough, and who carried the ones he hadn't reached the way a man carries shrapnel he was never able to dig out. He was not unfriendly. He had simply chosen quiet and distance, and a cabin at the end of a mountain road where the only sound was wind and a dog. He had nothing left to prove to anyone. And on a night when a child crawled to his fence, he was about to discover he still had one more person to reach in time. He had served 22 years in the United States Navy and retired as senior chief petty officer out of the SEAL teams, with deployments across 2 wars and a string of places he had signed his name to never naming. After the service, he had trained search and rescue dogs and worked mountain recoveries until the bad winter 3 years back when a storm closed in, faster than the forecast promised, and he reached a stranded hiker 20 minutes too late. And after that, he had pulled back to the cabin outside Cold Fork, Alaska, to be alone with his guilt and his dog and the enormous indifferent country around him. He told himself he was done pulling people out of the snow. The snow, it turned out, was not done with him. The dog was named Kane, a 6-year-old German shepherd, 92 pounds of dark sable and dense muscle under a winter coat thick enough to hold the snow without it ever touching his skin, with a clipped notch in one ear from a fragment on a deployment, and the controlled, deliberate way of moving that only years of training produce. He had been a military working dog, a tracker and detection dog, and after that one of the best search dogs Jack had ever run. A nose that could pull a scent off a buried glove under 4 feet of snow, and a drive that would not quit while a single thread of trail remained. He was not a pet. He was the partner who had found the lost and the buried when no human could, and the one warm living thing that had stayed beside Jack Sutton in his self-imposed exile. And on this night, the old instinct had woken in him before any human could have known a thing was wrong. He had heard or smelled or simply sensed a child dying in the snow a quarter-mile out, and he had screamed for his handler. And then he had done the only thing a great dog can do while he waits for the man with the hands. He had laid his own body down against the cold and given the child his heat. Cold Fork was a small town tucked into a high valley in the Alaska range. A gas station and a roadhouse and a scatter of cabins strung along a single mountain highway that wound up over a pass and down the other side toward the lowland towns. It was the second week of December, and the dark came early and stayed long, and a storm had rolled down off the peaks that evening with a forecast that lied. 11 below and falling, the snow blowing horizontal. The kind of cold that turns a stalled car into a coffin and gives a person on foot less time than they think they have. The highway over the pass was the only road, and on a night like this it belonged to the storm. Somewhere down off the shoulder of that road, in the dark and the drifting snow, a man was trapped in a crushed truck, slowly freezing, while his 8-year-old daughter crawled away to find help she had no real reason to believe existed. The man who had put them there was named Dean Whitlock, and he owned half of what mattered in the valley. Whitlock ran the regional auto group, 3 dealerships and a service empire, and sat on the borough assembly, and his name was on the hockey rink and the volunteer fire hall and the campaign signs of half the local officials. He was 53, polished and genial, a man who knew everyone's name and bought around at the roadhouse. What the valley did not see, because Whitlock's money and Whitlock's friends had spent years making sure it stayed unseen, was the other Dean Whitlock, the one who drank and drove, who had walked away from 2 prior incidents that should have cost him his license and his freedom, both quietly made to vanish by a phone call to the right friend. On the night of the storm, he had been driving home over the pass with a skinful of bourbon and too much speed, and he had drifted across the center line on a blind curve and clipped an oncoming truck and sent it off the shoulder into the dark. And he had felt the impact and seen the headlights spin away below him, and he had kept driving. "Accidents happen on that pass every winter," he would say later, smooth as glass. "I never touched anybody." He believed he was untouchable. In that valley for years he had been exactly right. The little girl's name was Annie, and she was 8 years old, and she was the only reason her father was still alive. She and her dad, David, had been driving home from a doctor's appointment in the lowlands, just the 2 of them. Annie's mother had died of cancer the year before, and it was David and Annie against the world now, and they were good at it. When the truck went off the road and rolled to a stop wedged against the trees 40 feet below the shoulder, David had been pinned and bleeding and fading, and he had done the bravest and hardest thing a father can do. He had told his terrified daughter to climb out the broken window and walk uphill to the road and follow it to a light, any light, and not to stop, and not to come back for him no matter what. Annie had not wanted to leave him. She had done it anyway, because he asked her to, and she had climbed up to that road and seen no lights at all in the screaming white dark. And then, far off through the snow, she had seen one, a single yellow porch light at the end of a long drive. She had walked toward it until she couldn't walk, and then she had crawled, and somewhere in the last stretch she had heard a dog, and she had crawled toward the dog. She had more courage in her small frozen body than most grown men find in a lifetime, and she had spent the last of it to reach a fence. Jack got her inside and did everything 22 years had taught him about a freezing body. Warmed core first, slow and careful, wrapped and watched, the satellite phone already calling for a medevac that the storm might or might not allow. And in the few clear words Annie could give him before the warmth pulled her under, the picture came. A truck, her daddy, off the road, down in the dark, another truck that didn't stop. Jack Sutton looked out the black window at a storm that had once cost him a life he couldn't reach in time, and he made a decision in half a second. He could not carry an injured man up a 40-foot slope alone in a whiteout, and he could not afford to search blind. But he had something better than 100 searchers. He pulled on his gear, and he clipped a line to K9's harness, and he gave the old search dog Annie's snow-crusted mitten to scent, and he said the word that woke the best part of the dog up: "Find him." K9 put his nose down into the blizzard and went to work, and Jack went out into the dark behind him on a rope, and the dog backtracked the girl's buried trail across a quarter-mile of drifting snow he could not have followed himself, straight to a broken place in the snowbank at the edge of the pass. Below them, wedged against the trees, a crushed truck. David, Annie's father, was unconscious and going cold, an hour, maybe less, from the end. Jack got down the slope, got him stabilized and onto the litter he'd hauled, and with the dog and the rope and everything he had left in his arms, he brought a dying man back. Up to the road as the medevac found a single gap in the storm and dropped in. David lived. He lived because an 8-year-old crawled to a fence, and a retired war dog lay down in the snow, and a man who thought he was done, reaching people, reached one more in time. It would have ended there, a miracle and a rescue, except that Jack Sutton had spent too many years reading scenes to miss what the morning light showed him on the wreck. The damage was wrong for a single car slide. There was paint on the driver's side that did not belong to David's truck, a deep, expensive blue, and ground into the snow near the top of the slope, a shattered piece of a headlight assembly that had not come off the family's old pickup. Someone had hit them and run. And when the local trooper detachment took the report, something went strange and slow and quiet, because the local contact wrote it up as a weather accident, and the blue paint somehow didn't make the first report. And Jack, who had watched powerful men make inconvenient facts disappear in a dozen countries, recognized the smell of it instantly. He took the broken headlight piece and the photographs of the paint, and he called the Alaska State Troopers down in the valley, the ones who did not owe Dean Whitlock a thing. The crisis came as these things come, with money and friends and a comfortable certainty. Whitlock had spent the storm's aftermath getting his blue truck quietly into a back bay at one of his own dealerships for bodywork, and word reached him that a recluse up the pass was asking questions, and he made the calls he always made. For a few days it looked airtight. The local report said accident. The powerful man said he'd been home all night, and a frightened valley was not eager to call its biggest employer a liar. David lay in a hospital bed in Anchorage, with a shattered leg and a daughter who would not leave his side, and it began to look as though the man who'd left them to freeze would, once again, simply drive away clean. Jack sat in his cold cabin with the broken headlight piece on the table and K9's head on his knee, and the old guilt rose up in him. The storm 3 years ago, the one he hadn't reached. But this time he had reached them, and he was not, this time, going to let the man who'd done it walk. The gloves came off. It was the dog who closed the trap, in the end. The state investigator who finally drove up the pass was a sergeant named Dolan, who had no love for the borough's untouchables, and Jack gave him the headlight piece, and Dolan ran the part number, and it came back to one make and model of luxury truck, in one specific trim, sold in that valley by exactly one dealership. They got a warrant for the service bays of Whitlock Auto Group over the loud objections of Whitlock's lawyer, and Jack brought K9. In a back bay under a tarp sat a deep blue truck with fresh damage to its front corner and a missing piece. When they pulled the tarp, K9, who had carried the scent of that crash site in his nose for a week, went rigid and fixed on the vehicle and gave a long, certain alert. The broken headlight piece fit the truck's empty socket exactly. The blue paint matched, and the dog who had tracked a dying man through a blizzard had now tracked the lie all the way home. They found Dean Whitlock in his showroom, shaking hands mid-smile. Jack stood in the doorway with Sergeant Dolan and did not raise his voice. "Senior Chief Jack Sutton, United States Navy, retired," he said, and the showroom went quiet. "2 nights ago you ran a man and his 8-year-old daughter off the pass, and you kept driving. He was pinned in that truck, freezing to death. She crawled a quarter mile through 11 below in the dark to find help, because the man who hit them couldn't be bothered to stop." He nodded toward the back of the building. "Your truck's in your own service bay with the corner caved in and a headlight missing. We've got the piece. We've got the paint. And the dog that pulled her father out of that ravine just identified your vehicle." He let it land. "You've made things disappear in this valley before. You're not going to make this one disappear. The troopers don't work for you." Whitlock's easy smile came apart in real time. This is harassment. That damages from a parking lot. My lawyer will bury you. Do you have any idea who He looked around his own showroom for the deference that had armored him for years, and found his service manager staring at the floor, and Sergeant Dolan with the warrant, and 2 of his own salespeople backing away, and nowhere in any of it the thing he was looking for. "You can't prove," he started, smaller now. "The part number already did," Dolan said, and read him his rights in the middle of his own showroom. What the investigation pulled up over the following weeks was the whole buried history. The 2 prior incidents quietly killed. The favors, the friend in the local detachment who'd shaded the first report, all of it dragged into the light at last. Nobody spoke for a long while after they walked Dean Whitlock out past his own glossy banners. A salesman who'd worked for him 11 years stood with his arms crossed and watched him go. Jack felt no satisfaction in it, none, only the flat, clean tiredness of a wrong being set right that should never have been allowed. He turned away before it was finished and drove the long road to Anchorage with a dog in the passenger seat, because there was a little girl in a hospital who had asked, every single day, about the dog who lay down in the snow with her. By the following summer, the long Alaskan light was back, and there were 2 new faces at the cabin at the end of the mountain road most weekends. David's leg had healed enough to walk the property with a cane, and Annie, who had crawled through a blizzard at 8 years old and lived, ran. Ahead of him through the fireweed with a gray-muzzled shepherd loping at her side, the two of them inseparable since the night at the fence. Dean Whitlock pleaded guilty to felony hit-and-run, driving under the influence, and tampering with evidence. His dealerships were sold off, his assembly seat was gone. The buried prior cases were reopened, and he went to prison while the friend who'd shaded the report lost his job and his certification. David and Annie kept coming up the pass, and somewhere in those visits the recluse at the end of the road stopped being a recluse, because it is hard to stay alone when an 8-year-old has decided you are family and a dog agrees with her. On a long golden evening in July, Jack Sutton sat on the porch he had hidden behind for 3 years and watched a little girl throw a stick across the yard for a dog who chased it, with his ears up, barking once at the enormous Alaskan sky for the pure joy of being alive under it. And the cabin was not silent anymore, and the man who had stopped reaching people had reached the two who, it turned out, had been sent to reach him. Sometimes the smallest, most broken down among us are braver than all the rest. An 8-year-old girl, half frozen, did the one thing her father asked and crawled into a screaming storm toward a single far-off light, and a dog laid his own body down in the snow to keep a stranger's child alive. And between the courage of a child and the loyalty of a dog, a dying man was carried home. The world has its share of powerful men who hit you and keep driving, who trust their money and their friends to make the wreckage disappear, and for a while, they are right. But a broken headlight does not lie, and a faithful dog does not forget a scent, and the truth has a way of crawling, like a child in the snow, toward whatever light it can find. God does not always stop the storm before it hits us, but he sends, into the worst of it, the ones who will not stop reaching. A brave child, a loyal dog, a man who thought he was finished and discovers he is not. Keep the porch light on. Someone may be crawling toward it through the dark right now. If this story touched your heart, share it with someone who needs the reminder that courage often comes in the smallest packages, and that no storm lasts as long as the love that walks into it. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from. And tell us this: have you ever kept a light on for someone, or been the one crawling toward it? Your story may be exactly the light someone else needs tonight. And if you believe in courage, loyalty, and the people and animals who refuse to stop reaching for us, please subscribe to the channel so you never miss the next one. May God bless you, protect your family, keep a light burning for the ones lost in the dark tonight, and remind you always, no one who is still crawling toward the light is ever truly beyond saving.